June 23, 1941. 4:47 a.m. Eastern Poland near the town of Brody. Oberleutnant Hans von Luck commanded a column of Panzer III tanks from the 7th Panzer Division, spearheading the advance into Soviet territory. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, had begun less than 48 hours earlier. Already, the Wehrmacht was ahead of schedule. Soviet resistance had been disorganized, confused, ineffective. Von Luck's crews were veterans. They had swept through Poland in 1939, crushed France in 1940, and conquered the Balkans in 1941. They knew their machines intimately, understood their capabilities, and more importantly, understood their enemy's weaknesses. Polish tanks had been obsolete. French tanks had been poorly coordinated. British tanks in North Africa were mechanically unreliable. The Panzer III, with its 50-gun and battle-tested crew, had proven superior to everything they'd faced. The morning mist was lifting when von Luck's lead tank commander, Feldwebel Otto Carius, reported movement ahead. Soviet tanks, he said, moving through a wheat field about 1,200 meters distant. Von Luck raised his binoculars, expecting to see the usual Soviet equipment, T-26 light tanks with thin armor and weak guns, or BT-7 cavalry tanks built for speed, but vulnerable to anything larger than a machine gun. What he saw instead made no sense. The silhouette was wrong, too low, too wide. The armor sloped at angles he'd never seen on any tank, Soviet or otherwise. The turret was larger than expected, suggesting a gun far heavier than anything Soviet tanks were supposed to carry. Von Luck assumed he was seeing heavy tanks, KV-1s perhaps, which German intelligence had warned about. But these moved too quickly, maneuvered too easily to be the lumbering heavy tanks in Soviet service. Engage at maximum range, von Luck ordered. His formation deployed into firing positions, each Panzer III traversing its turret to track the approaching Soviet armor. At 1,200 meters, they opened fire. The 15 armor-piercing rounds were accurate, well-aimed shots from experienced crews. Von Luck watched the impacts through his binoculars, waiting for the satisfying explosion that signaled a successful penetration. The shells bounced off. Not all of them, but enough. He saw the distinctive spark of deflection as armor-piercing rounds glanced off the sloped armor without penetrating. The Soviet tanks, apparently unbothered by being under fire, continued advancing. At 800 meters, they began returning fire. Von Luck's world changed in that moment. The Soviet guns, far larger than anything a medium tank should carry, fired with a sound like thunder. The lead Panzer III in von Luck's formation simply exploded. One moment it was a functioning war machine, the next it was burning wreckage. The shell had punched through the front armor, through the crew compartment, and detonated the ammunition. There was no time to escape. The 2nd Panzer III was hit moments later, the round penetrating so cleanly that the tank didn't immediately burn. It simply stopped, dead in place, smoke seeping from hatches as the crew tried desperately to abandon the vehicle. Von Luck screamed orders to withdraw. His remaining tanks reversed frantically, laying smoke to cover their retreat. Behind them, 2 more panzers were destroyed trying to maneuver. The Soviet tanks, these impossible machines that shouldn't exist, pursued for nearly a kilometer before breaking off. Von Luck's column had lost 5 tanks in less than 4 minutes, against what he would later learn were just 3 Soviet medium tanks. That night, gathering his surviving crews in a farmhouse commandeered for headquarters, von Luck tried to make sense of what they'd witnessed. His men, combat veterans who had never shown fear facing Polish, French, or British armor, were shaken. The Soviet tanks had been immune to their guns at combat range. The Soviet guns had destroyed German tanks with single shots. Worse, the Soviets had been faster, more maneuverable, and apparently more numerous than intelligence had suggested. "What the hell are those things?" Carius asked, his hands still trembling from adrenaline and shock. Von Luck had no answer. German intelligence had provided detailed briefings on Soviet equipment. They knew about T-26 light tanks, BT-7 cavalry tanks, and KV-1 heavy tanks. Nobody had mentioned a medium tank with sloped armor, a 76 gun, and performance that exceeded anything in the Wehrmacht's inventory. The T-34 had been completely unknown to German intelligence. This wasn't an intelligence failure. It was an intelligence catastrophe. The story of the T-34 begins not with military planners, but with an American engineer who never set foot in the Soviet Union. J. Walter Christie was a brilliant, difficult, largely ignored inventor who spent the 1920s and 1930s trying to convince the U.S. Army to adopt his revolutionary tank suspension system. The Christie suspension used large road wheels mounted on long vertical springs, allowing tanks to travel at high speeds cross-country without shaking themselves apart. The U.S. Army, conservative and underfunded, saw little value in fast tanks. Doctrine emphasized infantry support, not rapid maneuver. Christie's designs, which could reach 70 kilometers per hour on roads, seemed like unnecessary extravagance. After years of rejection, Christie sold several of his designs abroad. The British bought some. The Poles bought some. And in 1930, the Soviet Union bought two, along with manufacturing rights. Soviet tank designers studying Christie's suspension recognized something American planners had missed. Speed meant survivability. A fast tank could choose engagements, exploit breakthroughs, and avoid artillery. The Red Army, shaped by Mikhail Tukhachevsky's theory of deep operations, needed tanks that could penetrate enemy lines and operate deep in the rear. Christie's suspension made this possible. The Soviets developed the BT series of cavalry tanks using Christie's system. These were fast, sometimes exceeding 50 kilometers per hour cross-country, but they retained the thin armor and light guns that made them vulnerable in direct combat. By the mid-1930s, Soviet designers understood they needed something better. A tank that combined the mobility of the BT series with armor and firepower sufficient to dominate the battlefield. Mikhail Koshkin, chief designer at the Kharkov locomotive factory, received the assignment in 1937. Design a medium tank, he was told, that could replace both the BT cavalry tanks and the T-26 infantry tanks. It should be fast, well-armored, powerfully armed, and simple enough to be mass-produced by workers with minimal training. These requirements seemed contradictory. Armor meant weight. Weight meant slow speed. Powerful guns meant large turrets. Large turrets meant taller profiles and bigger targets. Koshkin's solution was radical: sloped armor instead of vertical plates. Mount armor at sharp angles. A shell striking at an angle had to penetrate more material than one striking perpendicularly. More importantly, shells often deflected off angled surfaces without penetrating at all. The concept wasn't new. French designers had experimented with it, but nobody had built an entire tank around maximizing slope angles. The prototype, designated A-20, featured armor sloped at 60 degrees from vertical on the glacis plate. This meant 45 mm of armor, sloped, provided protection equivalent to 90 mm of vertical armor. The sides, rear, and turret also used sloping where possible. The result was a tank that looked strange, almost alien, compared to the boxy designs dominating other armies. Armament was the 76.2 mm L11 gun, a high-velocity weapon adapted from anti-aircraft artillery. This was larger than any gun mounted on a medium tank anywhere in the world. German Panzer IIIs carried 50 mm guns. American Shermans, not yet designed, would carry 75 mm guns. British Crusaders mounted 40 mm guns. The T-34 would outgun them all, and it hadn't even entered production yet. The engine was a V2 diesel, a 12-cylinder powerplant producing 500 horsepower. Diesel was crucial. Gasoline engines used in most tanks were fire hazards. A single penetrating hit often ignited fuel and ammunition, immolating crews. Diesel was far less flammable. Soviet tankers, who expected to be hit, needed engines that wouldn't turn their vehicles into crematoriums. The transmission was crude, difficult to operate, and would remain a weak point throughout the T-34's service life. Shifting gears required strength and timing. Inexperienced drivers often ground gears or stalled the engine. But once moving, the Christie suspension and powerful engine gave the T-34 performance that astonished observers. In trials, it reached 53 kilometers per hour on roads and maintained 25 kilometers per hour cross-country through terrain that would bog down any other tank. In December 1939, Koshkin personally drove two prototype T-34s from Kharkov to Moscow, a journey of over 700 kilometers in winter conditions, to demonstrate the design to Stalin and the Defense Committee. The demonstration succeeded. Stalin, impressed by the combination of mobility, armor, and firepower, ordered the T-34 into immediate production. Koshkin, exhausted from the journey and exposure to severe cold, developed pneumonia. He died in September 1940, never seeing his creation in combat. Production began in 1940 at multiple factories. The Kharkov plant, Stalingrad tractor factory, and several other facilities tooled up to build the new tank. By June 1941, when Germany invaded, the Soviet Union had produced approximately 1,200 T-34s. This sounds impressive until you realize the Red Army fielded over 20,000 tanks total. They represented only 6% of Soviet armor. The rest consisted of obsolete T-26s, BT-7s, and various light tanks that German panzers could destroy with ease. Worse, doctrine for employing the T-34 didn't exist. Crews trained on older tanks received T-34s with minimal familiarization. Maintenance procedures were unclear. Spare parts were scarce. Radio equipment, already rare in Soviet tanks, was almost non-existent in T-34s. Most tanks could only receive radio signals, not transmit, meaning tactical coordination was nearly impossible. Tank commanders communicated by flags or by stopping to shout at each other. When Operation Barbarossa began, most T-34s were scattered across Western Soviet military districts, often in ones and twos rather than concentrated formations. German intelligence, having analyzed destroyed Soviet tanks from the 1939 Polish campaign and 1939-1940 Winter War against Finland, concluded that Soviet armor was obsolete, poorly maintained, and incompetently employed. They were correct about most of the Soviet tank force. They were completely wrong about the T-34. The first encounters, like von Luck's experience near Brody, shocked German tank crews. Reports filtered back to division headquarters describing invulnerable Soviet tanks that shrugged off 50 armor-piercing rounds and destroyed panzers with single shots. Initial reaction from higher command was skepticism. Crews under stress exaggerate threats, officers said. Soviet tanks are obsolete. Everyone knows this. Then more reports arrived, and more. By July 1941, the pattern was undeniable. The Wehrmacht was facing a tank that was superior to anything Germany fielded. General Heinz Guderian, commander of Panzer Group II and arguably Germany's foremost armor expert, encountered T-34s in late June. His after-action report was blunt. The T-34 is the best tank in the world. Our tanks are inferior in armor, mobility, and armament. This created an immediate crisis. The entire Barbarossa plan assumed German armor superiority. Panzer divisions would smash through Soviet defenses, encircle armies, and advance deep into Soviet territory. But if Soviet tanks were superior, the foundation of German strategy was flawed. Hitler, receiving reports of German tank losses to an unknown Soviet weapon, demanded immediate answers. How many of these T-34s existed? Where were they manufactured? Could German tanks be upgraded to match them? The answers were unsatisfying. Intelligence estimated the Soviets had 1,000 to 2,000 T-34s, a gross underestimate. Multiple factories were producing them, meaning production would continue even if some facilities were captured. Upgrading existing panzers was possible, but would take time Germany didn't have. The uncomfortable truth was that Germany had invaded the Soviet Union with technically inferior armor and no immediate solution. German tankers, meanwhile, were learning to fight T-34s through bitter experience. The sloped armor made frontal engagement suicidal. Shooting at the front of a T-34 from typical combat ranges, 800 to 1,200 meters, simply wasted ammunition. The rounds either bounced off or failed to penetrate. Veteran crews learned to target the sides and rear, where armor was thinner and less sloped. But this required maneuver, coordination, and often accepting casualties to create flanking opportunities. The 88-man aircraft gun pressed into anti-tank service could penetrate armor at range. But 88s were scarce, heavy, and required time to deploy. Tank versus tank combat demanded mobile solutions. Some crews began using hollow charge rounds, which were less affected by sloped armor. Others tried to disable T-34s by targeting tracks or vision devices, immobilizing them for later destruction. The Luftwaffe, still dominant in Soviet skis in 1941, became the primary counter to T-34 concentrations. Stuka dive bombers could destroy tanks with direct hits from heavy bombs, but this required air support, which wasn't always available. Ground forces needed weapons that could reliably defeat T-34s without waiting for airstrikes. The problem was urgent and getting worse. Because the Soviets, despite catastrophic losses in the first months of Barbarossa, were building T-34s faster than Germany could destroy them. The Stalingrad tractor factory alone was producing 200 tanks per month by late 1941. The Kharkov plant, until its capture, produced similar numbers. Other factories were being established beyond the Urals, out of range of German bombers. Even as millions of Soviet soldiers surrendered and thousands of tanks were destroyed, production continued. The design simplicity enabled this mass production. T-34s lacked the precision engineering of German tanks. Tolerances were loose. Finish was crude. Turrets often didn't traverse smoothly. Vision devices were primitive. Crew comfort was ignored. But these compromises allowed unskilled workers, many of them women and teenagers with minimal training, to assemble tanks in factories that were sometimes partially roofless and unheated. German tanks, by contrast, were precision instruments. A Panzer III required skilled machinists and careful assembly. Quality control was rigorous. Each tank received extensive testing before delivery. This produced reliable, well-made vehicles. It also meant German factories produced 250 Panzer IIIs per month across all facilities, while single Soviet factories were producing 200 T-34s monthly. This mechanical crudeness actually enhanced battlefield survivability. Loose tolerances meant mud, ice, and dirt didn't jam mechanisms as easily. The wide tracks, originally designed to support the tank's weight, distributed pressure so effectively that T-34s could traverse mud that would bog down narrower German tracks. Soviet tankers would joke that the T-34 was designed by engineers who understood Russian mud. The diesel engine, though underpowered by Western standards, was nearly indestructible. It could run on poor-quality fuel, operate in extreme cold with minimal preparation, and continue functioning with damage that would kill a gasoline engine. Maintenance was simple enough that crew members could perform most repairs with basic tools. German tank crews, accustomed to complex maintenance procedures, were astonished to watch disabled T-34s being repaired and returned to combat within hours. By winter 1941, as the German advance stalled before Moscow, T-34s began appearing in larger numbers and with better-trained crews. The Soviets were learning to employ their superior tank effectively. Instead of dispersing T-34s as support for infantry, they concentrated them in tank brigades that could exploit breakthroughs or counterattack German penetrations. When used properly, these formations were devastating. The Battle of Moscow, Germany's first major defeat, featured T-34s prominently. Soviet counteroffensives in December 1941 used T-34 brigades as exploitation forces, punching through weakened German lines and advancing deep into rear areas. German infantry, lacking effective anti-tank weapons for winter combat, could only retreat or die. Panzer divisions, exhausted and under strength, couldn't contain multiple simultaneous breakthroughs. One engagement exemplified the T-34's impact. Near Klin, northwest of Moscow, a German infantry regiment established defensive positions blocking the main road. They had anti-tank guns, entrenched infantry, and mines. Standard defensive doctrine suggested this position could hold for days against armor attack. A Soviet tank brigade with 40 T-34s attacked at dawn, advancing through a snowstorm that limited visibility. The German anti-tank guns, 37 and 50 weapons, opened fire at 600 meters. The T-34s drove through the fire without slowing. Shells bounced off their sloped armor, creating showers of sparks but no penetrations. The Soviet tanks crashed through the defensive line, crushing anti-tank guns beneath their tracks and machine-gunning infantry positions. The entire German position collapsed in less than an hour. Survivors reported that shooting at T-34s was like shooting at battleships with rifles. The psychological effect was devastating. German commanders studying these battles realized they faced not just a technical problem but a conceptual one. They represented a different philosophy of tank design. German tanks prioritized crew comfort, mechanical reliability, and precision engineering. The T-34 prioritized armor, mobility, and firepower while accepting crude construction and minimal crew comfort. In the brutal arithmetic of the Eastern Front, the Soviet approach was proving more effective. Hitler, furious at the failure to capture Moscow and alarmed by reports of T-34 superiority, ordered immediate development of tanks that could match or exceed Soviet capabilities. This directive would lead to the Panther and Tiger tanks, magnificent machines that exceeded the T-34 in many respects. But development would take time. Production would take more time. In the meantime, German tankers had to fight T-34s with Panzer IIIs and IVs that were fundamentally outclassed. The spring of 1942 brought new German offensives and new encounters with T-34s. German crews had learned tactics that improved their survival: never engage frontally, coordinate with infantry and artillery, use terrain to force T-34s into positions where their sides were exposed. But tactics couldn't overcome fundamental capability gaps. A well-handled T-34 could still destroy multiple German tanks before being knocked out. Oberfeldwebel Otto Carius, who survived that first encounter near Brody, wrote after the war about fighting T-34s in 1942. "We learned to respect the T-34. Its armor was magnificent, its gun was powerful, and its mobility exceeded ours. Our only advantages were better optics, better training, and better coordination. Against inexperienced Soviet crews, this was sufficient. Against veterans, we needed luck and often superior numbers." The Soviets, meanwhile, were improving the T-34. The 1942 model featured a more powerful gun, the 76.2 F-34, with better armor penetration. Production quality improved as workers gained experience. Crew training improved as the Red Army recovered from the catastrophic losses of 1941. Radio equipment became more common, enabling better coordination. The T-34 that German tankers faced in 1942 was more dangerous than the version they'd encountered in 1941. By mid-1942, T-34 production exceeded 1,000 tanks per month across all Soviet factories. This number would rise to over 1,300 per month by early 1943. For comparison, Germany produced approximately 500 tanks of all types per month in 1942. The arithmetic was brutal. Even if German tanks were qualitatively superior, which they weren't, the quantitative gap was decisive. The Soviets could afford to trade 3 T-34s for 1 Panzer IV. Germany couldn't afford to trade any tanks at all. The Battle of Stalingrad, beginning in August 1942, saw T-34s employed in the brutal urban combat that ultimately destroyed Germany's Sixth Army. Soviet commanders used T-34s as mobile artillery, driving them up to buildings and firing directly into German positions at point-blank range. The armor that made them immune to anti-tank rifles also made them immune to Panzerfaust hollow charges at the extreme close ranges of urban combat. German after-action reports from Stalingrad describe encounters where T-34s drove into defensive positions, absorbed multiple hits from infantry anti-tank weapons, and continued fighting until destroyed by concentrated fire or mechanical failure. The psychological impact on German infantry, watching their anti-tank weapons prove ineffective, was catastrophic. Soldiers who had stopped French tanks in 1940 with 37 guns found themselves helpless against Soviet armor in 1942. The Soviet counteroffensive at Stalingrad, Operation Uranus, employed multiple tank corps equipped primarily with T-34s. These formations punched through Romanian and Italian positions on the flanks of the German salient, then advanced rapidly to encircle the Sixth Army. German attempts to break the encirclement failed partly because panzer divisions couldn't overcome the T-34-equipped Soviet tank brigades blocking their advance. By early 1943, the T-34 had become the most numerous tank on the Eastern Front. The Soviets fielded over 8,000 of them, compared to approximately 2,000 German tanks of all types. This numerical advantage, combined with the T-34's technical superiority over most German armor, gave the Red Army increasing confidence in offensive operations. The question was no longer whether Soviet armor could defeat German armor, but how quickly. The Battle of Kursk, in July 1943, would be the ultimate test. Germany committed nearly 3,000 tanks and assault guns to Operation Citadel, including the new Panther and Tiger tanks designed specifically to counter the T-34. The Soviets deployed over 5,000 tanks, the majority being T-34s, in elaborate defensive positions designed to channel German attacks into killing zones. The southern prong of the German offensive, led by IISS Panzer Corps, encountered concentrated formations near Prokhorovka on July 12. What followed was the largest tank battle in history, with over 800 tanks engaged in a relatively small area. The T-34s, unable to penetrate the heavy armor of Tigers and Panthers at range, closed to point-blank distance where their guns were effective, and German advantages in armor and optics became irrelevant. German tankers, accustomed to engaging at 1,500 to 2,000 meters, where their better optics and longer-range guns provided advantage, found themselves in a swirling melee at ranges under 500 meters. At these distances, T-34 guns could penetrate even Tiger armor if they hit weak points. The battle devolved into chaos, with tanks maneuvering desperately to avoid being flanked while seeking opportunities to shoot enemy vehicles in the sides or rear. Hauptsturmführer Rudolf von Ribbentrop, commanding a Panther company at Prokhorovka, reported, "The T-34s came at us like a cavalry charge. We destroyed many, but they kept coming. They were willing to accept horrific losses to close the range. Once they got close, our armor advantage meant nothing. We lost 5 Panthers in 15 minutes. I had never seen such disregard for casualties." The Soviets lost heavily at Prokhorovka, perhaps 300 T-34s destroyed in a single day, but they could afford these losses. Soviet factories would replace them within 2 weeks. Germany, losing perhaps 80 tanks at Prokhorovka, couldn't replace them for months. The strategic arithmetic favored the side that could sustain losses, not the side that inflicted them. Kursk marked the end of German strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. After July 1943, Germany would fight defensively, attempting to delay the inevitable Soviet advance. The T-34 would be the instrument of that advance, its armor and mobility enabling the deep operations that would carry the Red Army from Kursk to Berlin. In 1944, the Soviets introduced the T-34-85, mounting an 85 gun in a larger 3-man turret. This variant could engage the front armor of Panthers and Tigers with reasonable chance of penetration. The 85 gun, adapted from anti-aircraft artillery, had penetration performance equivalent to the German 88. Combined with the existing advantages in mobility and reliability, the T-34-85 was arguably the best all-around tank of the war. German tankers who survived to 1944 and 1945 describe a sense of resignation. They knew Soviet armor was superior in numbers and comparable in quality. They knew German industry couldn't match Soviet production. They knew the war was lost, but they continued fighting, partly from discipline, partly from fear of Soviet revenge, and partly because surrendering to the Soviets seemed worse than continuing to fight. Otto Carius, who fought on the Eastern Front from 1941 to 1945 and survived with 150-plus tank kills, wrote, "By 1944, seeing T-34s was as common as seeing clouds. They were everywhere. We might destroy 10 in a day, but 20 would appear tomorrow. The Soviets didn't need to outfight us. They simply had to outlast us. And they did." The production numbers tell the story. From 1940 to 1945, the Soviet Union produced approximately 84,000 tanks. Of these, roughly 57,000 were T-34s in various models. Germany, over the same period, produced approximately 27,000 tanks and assault guns of all types. The Soviet Union was building more than 2 T-34s for every tank Germany produced, and the T-34 was superior to most German vehicles. This industrial dominance reflected different approaches to warfare. German tanks were complex, expensive, and required skilled labor to produce. T-34s were simple, cheap, and could be built by semi-skilled workers. A Panther cost approximately 120,000 Reichsmarks and required 150,000 man-hours to produce. A cost approximately 193,000 rubles, roughly 70,000 Reichsmarks equivalent, and required 3,700 man-hours. The Soviet Union could build 3 T-34s in the time Germany built 1 Panther. The design philosophy extended to crew training. German tankers received extensive training, sometimes 6 months, before entering combat. Soviet tankers often received as little as 2 weeks training before being sent to the front. The T-34 was designed to be operated by minimally trained crews. Controls were crude but functional. Tactics emphasized mass and aggression over finesse. Casualties were expected and accepted. This approach horrified Western observers but proved devastatingly effective. The T-34 wasn't the best tank for crew survival or comfort. It was the best tank for winning a war of attrition against an opponent with superior initial training and tactics, but inferior industrial capacity. Every design choice reflected this priority. Sloped armor for maximum protection with minimum weight, diesel engines for reliability and reduced fire risk. Wide tracks for mobility in poor terrain, simple construction for mass production. By 1945, as the Red Army advanced into Germany, T-34s were ubiquitous. They spearheaded every major offensive, exploited every breakthrough, and pursued retreating German forces relentlessly. German civilians, watching columns of Soviet armor enter their cities, saw T-34s as symbols of Soviet power and German defeat. The tank that had been unknown in June 1941 had become the face of the Red Army by May 1945. The final battles in Berlin saw T-34s fighting in urban terrain for which they were never designed. They absorbed incredible punishment from Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets fired by teenage soldiers and old men conscripted in desperation. Many T-34s were destroyed, sometimes multiple tanks on a single street. But there were always more. Soviet commanders, indifferent to tank losses so close to final victory, simply ordered fresh tanks forward to replace those destroyed. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, Soviet tank forces included over 25,000 T-34s of various models. They had carried the Red Army from the outskirts of Moscow to the Reichstag. They had participated in every major battle on the Eastern Front. They had suffered horrific losses, tens of thousands destroyed, but Soviet industry had simply built more. The Germans had started the war with technical and tactical superiority. They had ended it buried under an avalanche of T-34s they could neither match nor stop. Post-war analysis by Western military experts confirmed what German tankers had learned through bitter experience. The T-34 was the best tank of World War II when all factors were considered. It wasn't the most heavily armored, that was the German King Tiger. It wasn't the most powerfully armed, that was also the King Tiger. It wasn't the fastest or most reliable or most comfortable. But it was the best combination of armor, firepower, mobility, reliability, and producibility. It was the tank that won the war on the Eastern Front. The United States, studying captured T-34s after the war, was impressed enough to incorporate some design elements into post-war American tanks. The sloped armor that German tankers had cursed became standard on American designs. The diesel engine, once considered too slow for tanks, was adopted for reliability. The philosophy of simple, robust design that could be mass-produced influenced American tank development for decades. They remained in production until 1958, with over 84,000 units built. Many served in Soviet-aligned nations for decades after World War II. They fought in Korea, where American tankers in M-26 Pershings and M-4 Shermans learned the same lessons German tankers had learned in 1941. The T-34 was a formidable opponent. They fought in the Middle East, in Africa, in Southeast Asia. Some T-34s saw combat service into the 21st century, a testament to the basic soundness of the design. For German tankers who survived the war, the T-34 represented a lesson in humility. They had entered the Soviet Union confident in their superiority, convinced that German engineering and tactical skill would overcome any opponent. The T-34 taught them that engineering excellence without industrial capacity was insufficient, that tactical skill without quantitative superiority was inadequate, and that initial advantages meant nothing against an opponent willing to accept staggering losses while learning and adapting. Otto Carius, interviewed in the 1990s, was asked what weapon he feared most during the war. His answer was immediate: the T-34. Not because any single T-34 was unstoppable, but because there were always more. You could fight brilliantly, destroy 10 of them, and accomplish nothing because 20 more would arrive tomorrow. That was the genius of Soviet design. They built a tank that was good enough and could be produced in quantities that made quality irrelevant. This is the true story of the T-34. Not the myth of the indestructible superweapon, but the reality of a well-designed tank produced in overwhelming numbers by an industrial system that understood the mathematics of attrition warfare. It wasn't invincible. Thousands were destroyed, their crews killed in fires that diesel engines couldn't prevent. But for every destroyed, Soviet factories built 2 more. And that simple arithmetic, more than any technical specification, is what won the war. German tankers feared nothing in June 1941. They had conquered Europe with machines they knew were superior to anything their enemies fielded. Then they saw their first T-34, watched their best shots bounce off sloped armor, watched their own tanks burning after being hit by guns that shouldn't exist on medium tanks. In that moment, the fundamental assumption underlying Operation Barbarossa, that German technical superiority would overcome Soviet numerical superiority, was revealed as catastrophically wrong. The war on the Eastern Front would continue for 4 more years. Millions would die. Entire cities would be destroyed. But the outcome was determined in those first encounters when German tankers realized they were facing not obsolete Soviet equipment, but a weapon system superior to their own. The T-34 didn't win the war alone, but it was the instrument through which Soviet industrial might and willing acceptance of casualties overwhelmed German tactical skill and technical sophistication. The wreckage of thousands of T-34s still litters the battlefields of Eastern Europe, silent testimony to the cost of victory. Inside many of those wrecks lie the remains of crew members who died when penetrating shots ignited ammunition, or when the tank burned after being disabled. The T-34 was never designed to keep its crew safe. It was designed to win a war of attrition. And it did, at a cost measured in tens of thousands of dead tankers, who climbed into vehicles they knew offered minimal protection but maximum effectiveness. This is the legacy of the T-34, a brutal demonstration that in industrial warfare, quantity has a quality all its own. That well-designed, adequate weapons produced in overwhelming numbers defeat superior weapons produced in inadequate quantities. That wars are won not by the side with the best individual soldiers or weapons, but by the side that can sustain losses while maintaining offensive capability. German tankers learned these lessons between 1941 and 1945, watching wave after wave of T-34s advance despite horrific losses. By the time they understood, it was far too late to matter. The T-34 was never the perfect tank. It was simply the right tank for the war that was actually fought, designed by engineers who understood that perfection matters less than presence, that sophistication matters less than simplicity, and that the tank that wins is the one that can be built faster than the enemy can destroy them. German tankers feared nothing when they invaded the Soviet Union. Then they met the T-34. And they learned to fear the sound of its diesel engine, the sight of its sloped armor, and most of all, the knowledge that no matter how many they destroyed, more were coming. Always more.